Discover DeCrypt lies at the heart of Gloucester city centre. There's been a church on this site since pre-Norman times. Of Gloucester's 12 medieval churches, several of which were called St Mary's, this was the only one to have a crypt. Straight in front of us is the remains of a tomb most likely brought down here from the church in the 19th century when there was extensive refurbishment. Over here is another significant piece of stone. It's hard to see the inscription now, but this is a late 15th century grave slab with incised cross and inscription to Isabel Pole, who was wife of a former mayor of Gloucester. A lot of the stone pieces that were down here had become contaminated with asbestos dust and sadly had to be sealed up behind the boarding on the south side of the crypt. The medieval crypt was substantially rebuilt by the Victorians. The vaulted brickwork we can see here dates from 1845, when a surveyor's report describes the very poor state of the crypt roof. During the 2018 work in the church, when the floor was excavated, the top of the brick vaulting was revealed. You can see just how little space there was in places between the roof of the crypt and the floor of the church. These pieces of stone may well be part of the battlements of the tower. St Mary DeCrypt Tower has become a bit of an icon in Gloucester's skyline, but it does look rather as if somebody sliced the top off. Formerly it had fine carved battlements and pinnacles. The vestry accounts over the centuries are full of references to repairing the tower and pinnacles. In 1908 the task finally became too much. The tower battlements and pinnacles had become unsafe. They were taken down, one of the pinnacles was even repaired, and they were stored here in the crypt. The plan was to raise funds to put them back, but despite the best efforts of the vicar and congregation, the money was never raised. The pinnacles have now disappeared, and only a few remnants of the battlements remain. Although the crypt started as a charnel house for the storage of bones, it's had many other uses in its history. From 1576 we know that part of the crypt was used as a tavern. It was known as the Crowd, which in those days meant an unruly mob. Brewing was big business. In fact, just next door, in the ruins of Greyfriars, there was a free supply of spring water piped from Robinswood Hill, which meant it was an ideal site for a brewery. During the Civil War, there was large-scale manufacture of gunpowder in Gloucester, at least 3 barrels a week. Part of the church was set up as a magazine for storage of this gunpowder in 1642 by an order of the city corporation, and the timber was stored in the crypt. At this time the church was not considered safe for services. During the month-long siege of Gloucester in August to September 1643, the church sustained a hit from cannon fire, quite possibly during the bombardment of the 13th to 14th of August, when 3 massive royalist cannon, 2 24-pounders and 1 12-pounder, attacked from Brunswick Square, at that time known as Gawdy Green. By the 1670s, the crypt was no longer being used as a tavern. Instead, it was let out to tenants as workshops or warehousing. At a vestry meeting on the 27th of December 1675, it was agreed that Josias Randall shall have the cellar and the standings under the church door at 50 shillings to be paid quarterly for the next 4 years. Josias Randall was a baker with a very successful local business. In fact, when he died in 1707, he was able to leave the sum of £50 in his will to be lent out to 5 tradesmen of the parish of St Mary DeCrypt, £10 each, interest-free, for a period of 10 years. At this time there would have been access to the crypt from Southgate Street, as well as from the churchyard. The practice of letting out the west end of the crypt continued until the mid-19th century. At a vestry meeting on the 10th of June 1830, it was resolved that certain moneys be given to Philo Maddy to quit the cellar under the church he then occupied. Philo Maddy was one of George and Gloucester's most successful businessmen. He was a currier, a leather worker. He also invested his profits in land, He bought High Orchard when it still was an orchard, and later sold it for the developing docks, making a huge profit. In fact, he made enough money to build Greyfriars House just behind St Mary DeCrypt, which is where he lived from 1810. We don't know why they wanted Maddie to give up his use of the crypt space. We do know that by the mid-19th century, churchyards across the country, and particularly in cities, were becoming very full, to the point of creating a public health hazard. This will have been the case at St Mary DeCrypt. A vestry meeting in 1831 discussed plans to join with other parishes in Gloucester to purchase land for a city cemetery. In Gloucester, the cemetery at Tredworth was opened in 1857, and city centre churchyards closed to burials at last. The surviving ledger stones in the crypt all date from after 1830, so it is possible that the decision to stop letting out the crypt space to Philo Maddie was to allow more space for burials. We know from excavations in the church itself in 2018 and earlier that there are numerous vaults beneath the nave, chancel and transepts. Vaults were sturdily built chambers into which coffins could be inserted. They were required for burials in the church, at least from the 18th century, largely for health and safety reasons. We have notes from a vestry meeting held on the 19th of April 1756. It was agreed that all persons burying in the church or chancel shall be obliged to make a vault in order to keep the ground level. In fact, one John Eckley had got into trouble for removing some of the foundation stones of the building while constructing his family vault and causing a serious problem. Along the east wall of the crypt, we can get an idea of what it would have been like in the 19th century when burials here were still taking place. The openings you can see were made to receive the coffins. Once the coffin had been inserted, they'd be sealed with a ledger stone giving details of the deceased. Here we have an unusual memorial. Anne Cook lived to 100 years, according to the inscription here, although there's no date on it. Her husband, Thomas, is buried below. He was a maltster. He died on the 13th of February 1852, aged 55. And here's a memorial to Marion Ashby, who died on May the 31st, 1851, aged only 16. Today, we have access to only a small part of the crypt. Much more remains to be discovered in the future.